On September 22, 1987, at 7:14 a.m., a barista at Starbucks in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., noticed something strange about a name written on a coffee cup. The customer had said Michael, but the barista who took the order had written Mikhail in Russian spelling. The store was only 2.3 miles from the Soviet embassy, on a busy corner of Wisconsin Avenue, where diplomats, college students, and federal employees mingled every morning during the coffee rush. Thousands of cups passed across the counter daily. But what was happening with certain specific cups, hidden in misspelled names and custom orders, was a form of communication that should not have existed on American soil, and it was discovered not by CIA cryptographers or counterintelligence experts, but by a 24-year-old linguistics student who realized that some spelling mistakes were not mistakes at all. Inspired by reports declassified after the end of the Soviet Union, this dramatization explores the unlikely methods the KGB used to operate in the shadows of the American capital in the final years of the Cold War, when critical messages were passed not through secure diplomatic channels, but through disposable coffee cups in a crowded Starbucks. On the morning of September 22, 1987, something began to unfold inside a Starbucks in Georgetown that would expose a KGB communication system operating in plain sight for at least 18 months. Starbucks had opened at that location in March 1986, part of the company's aggressive expansion outside Seattle. The store occupied the ground floor of a 3-story office building at the intersection of Wisconsin Avenue and N Street, strategically positioned between Georgetown University, the State Department office complex to the east, and the residential neighborhoods to the north, where hundreds of foreign diplomats lived. The location was not accidental from a commercial standpoint. Pedestrian traffic on weekday mornings regularly exceeded 400 people per hour between 6:30 and 9 a.m. The store had 18 seats, 7 employees on the morning shift, and processed an average of 340 orders during the morning rush. David Chen was 24 years old and had been working as a senior barista since the store opened. He was in his 3rd year of a doctoral program in comparative linguistics at Georgetown University, specializing in Slavic languages with a focus on Russian and Czech. The job at Starbucks paid for his apartment expenses and offered the flexible schedule he needed for his classes and research. His responsibilities included opening the store at 5:30 a.m., preparing the espresso systems, training new employees, and during the morning rush working simultaneously as a cashier and barista, taking orders, operating the espresso machine, and calling out names when drinks were ready. David had developed a peculiar skill during his 18 months working there. He could identify accents with remarkable accuracy. Accents from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America. His linguistic training made every interaction with customers an informal study opportunity. He often guessed the national origin of customers based on speech patterns, vocabulary choices, and nuances of pronunciation. It was this linguistic sensitivity that made him pause one Tuesday morning when a man in his mid-40s wearing a gray overcoat and carrying a black leather briefcase ordered a large Americano and said his name was Michael. The accent was imperceptible to most people, but to David, trained to detect microphonetic variations, there was something there, a slight hardness in the R, a specific quality in the middle vowel, markers consistent with native Russian speakers attempting to articulate American English. David wrote the name on the cup, Mikhail, the Russian form, deliberately. It was an impulse, half provocation, half test. He prepared the drink, placed the cup on the counter and called out, "Large Americano for Mikhail." The man walked up to the counter, picked up the cup, looked at the name written on it, and for a fraction of a second, his expression changed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. And then he nodded slightly to David, picked up the coffee and left. David stood watching as the man disappeared into the crowd on Wisconsin Avenue, wondering why that reaction had been so strange. For the next 2 weeks, David didn't think much about the incident. Georgetown was full of Russians, diplomats, academics, exchange students. It wasn't unusual, and he often played around with the spelling of names. John became John. Sarah became Sarah. Customers usually laughed or simply ignored it. But on October 6th at 7:22 a.m., the same man returned. Same gray overcoat, same black leather briefcase, He approached the register where David was taking orders and asked for a large Americano. "Name?" David asked. "Michael," the man replied, pronouncing the name with the same almost imperceptible accent. David wrote Mikhail again, this time more deliberately, watching the man's reaction. The man looked at the cup as David wrote, and again there was that brief flash of recognition. He paid, waited while David prepared the Americano, took the drink, and left without saying anything other than, "Thank you." But this time David noticed something else. When the man picked up the cup, he turned it slightly, studying the name for 2 or 3 seconds longer than would be natural. And then, as he walked toward the exit, he paused near the condiment table, added a small amount of sugar to his coffee. David saw this through the front window, and discarded the empty sugar packet. The man left, turned left on Wisconsin Avenue, and disappeared. 5 days later, on October 11th at 7:19 a.m., a second man walked in. Younger, maybe in his late 30s, dark hair, black-rimmed glasses, wearing a navy blue suit. He ordered a large latte. Name? Robert. The accent was different. British, David thought initially, but there was something underneath it, a secondary layer that didn't quite match. On impulse, David wrote Robertov, a Russified form of the name, technically incorrect but recognizable to any Russian speaker as a typical surname. He prepared the latte, called out the name, and watched. The man walked up to the counter, picked up the cup, and when his eyes landed on the name written on it, he paused for just a second. Then he looked directly at David, nodded once very slightly, and walked away. David stood behind the counter, his heart racing, unable to fully explain why, but feeling that he had stumbled upon something. Over the next 10 days, David began to pay specific attention. He looked for patterns, accents, reactions, customers who seemed to recognize when their names were written in unusual ways. On October 21st, the first man, Mikhail, returned. Large American coffee, same time, approximately 7:20. David wrote the name in Cyrillic this time, using real Russian characters. Mikhail. The man picked up the cup, looked at the name, and his eyebrows rose a fraction of a millimeter. He said nothing. But when he left, he didn't turn left onto Wisconsin Avenue, as he had the other times. He turned right. David watched through the window as the man walked about 30 meters, paused in front of a newsstand, bought a Washington Post, and stood there for several minutes, leafing through the newspaper. Then a woman approached, blonde, average height, wearing a green wool coat. She also stopped at the newsstand, picked up a magazine, and stood next to the man. They didn't speak. They didn't make eye contact. But David watched as the man folded his newspaper, tucked it under his arm with the Starbucks coffee cup still in his right hand, and walked away. The woman remained at the stand for a few more seconds, then followed in the same direction, keeping a distance of about 15 meters. David didn't know what he was witnessing, but every trained instinct he had about human behavior and communication told him there was meaning in it. That night, he started keeping a record, a small notebook he kept in his apron pocket. Dates, times, descriptions of customers, names requested, names written down, reactions. On November 4th, Robertov returned. Large latte. David wrote the name in Cyrillic. Robertov. The same brief pause, the same acknowledgement. And when the man left, he also stopped at the same newsstand, bought something, and stood there for several minutes before moving on. David noticed the pattern. Customers who reacted to the Russified names always stopped at the newsstand after leaving. They always stayed there for 2 to 4 minutes. And often someone else would appear near them within that time frame. They were using Starbucks as a signaling point. David Chen was not an intelligence analyst. He was a linguist, a doctoral student, whose idea of research normally involved syntactic analysis and phonetic comparisons. But the more he observed, the more convinced he became that he had stumbled upon something significant. On November 12, 1987, he made a decision. He would seek out his thesis advisor, Professor Anatoly Volkov, a Soviet immigrant who had left the USSR in 1978 and now taught Slavic linguistics at Georgetown. They met in Volkov's office on campus that afternoon. David brought his notebook, explained the patterns he had observed, described customers' reactions to Russified names, and mentioned the behavior at the newsstand. Professor Volkov listened quietly, occasionally asking questions about specific details. When David finished, the professor sat for a long moment, looking out the window of his office overlooking the Potomac River. Finally he spoke. "David, do you understand what you're telling me?" David nodded. I think it might be some kind of intelligence activity, but I'm not sure." Volkov leaned forward. "During my years in Moscow, I worked briefly as a translator for certain government departments. I saw operational methods. What you're describing resembles what we called confirmation markers, simple signals used to verify identities or confirm that a contact is active." He explained that when intelligence agents operated in hostile territory, they often needed to confirm that certain contacts were genuine and not counterintelligence traps. One way to do this was through benign signals that would be invisible to casual observers but would confirm identity to someone who knew what to look for. A name misspelled in a specific way could serve as such a signal. If the name on the cup matched a prearranged code, the agent would know it was safe to proceed to the next step, in this case, the newsstand. "But I'm the one writing the names," David said, "not the customers. How would that work?" Volkov considered this. "Perhaps you have accidentally inserted yourself into an existing system, or perhaps," he paused, "someone is using you as an unwitting flag." The implication made David's blood run cold. "You need to report this," Volkov said firmly. "If what you're observing is indeed intelligence activity operating through this coffee shop, the US authorities need to know." But David hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if it was just paranoia? He would ruin the reputation of innocent customers, possibly lose his job and look ridiculous. Volkov insisted. Better to err on the side of caution. During the Cold War, David, many successful operations were disrupted because someone noticed something small and had the courage to report it. On November 18th, David finally made his decision. He called the FBI field office in Washington, D.C. The person who answered was Special Agent Laura Brennan, a counterintelligence agent who had been working Soviet cases since the early 1980s. When David explained that he was a barista at a Starbucks in Georgetown and believed he might be witnessing foreign intelligence activity, there was a brief silence on the line. Then Brennan asked, "Why do you believe that?" David explained everything. The accents, the Russified names, the reactions, the behavior at the newsstand, the timing patterns. Brennan listened without interruption. When he finished, she asked a single question. "Is this happening now, today?" "It happens several times a week," David said, "usually between 7 and 8 in the morning." A meeting was scheduled for the next morning, Thursday, November 19th, at 6 a.m., an hour before Starbucks opened. Brennan and a second agent would meet David at the store. When David arrived to open at 5:30 a.m., 2 FBI agents were already waiting outside. Agent Brennan was a woman in her early 40s with short brown hair, wearing a professional gray suit. The second agent, Special Agent Robert Hayes, was younger, perhaps in his late 30s, tall and visibly alert. David let them in, turned on the lights, and for the next hour while he prepared the store to open, he explained everything in detail. He showed them his notebook. He described each of the customers he had observed. He drew a diagram showing the layout of the Starbucks, the location of the newsstand outside, and the routes customers took after leaving. Brennan asked specific questions. Did the customers always order the same drinks? Did they always come on the same days of the week? Was there any pattern to the variations in how their names were spelled? David reviewed his notebook. Mikhail always came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Robertov came on Mondays and Fridays. A third man he had noted, who ordered a cappuccino and said his name was Peter, but reacted when David wrote Pyotr, came irregularly, with no clear pattern. Brennan and Hayes exchanged glances. "You did well to call us," Brennan said finally. "What you're describing is consistent with known operational techniques used by foreign intelligence services. We need to set up surveillance." The plan was set. David would continue working as usual. He would not change anything about how he interacted with these customers. FBI agents would position themselves in and around Starbucks during peak morning hours, disguised as regular customers, and observe. If the patterns David had described proved consistent, the FBI would expand the operation. On Thursday, November 19th at 7 a.m., 2 FBI agents were stationed inside Starbucks, disguised as customers. One sat at a corner table reading the New York Times. The other waited in line as if placing an order. At 7:18 a.m., Mikhail entered. Gray overcoat, leather briefcase. He approached the counter where David was working. "Large Americano, please." Name: Michael. David wrote Mikhail in Cyrillic, just as he had done before. He prepared the drink. He called out the name. The man took the cup, looked at the name, nodded slightly, and left. The FBI agents watched through the front window as he walked to the newsstand, stopped, bought a Washington Post, and stood there leafing through it. About 2 minutes later, a woman approached. She was not the same woman David had seen before. This one was older, with grey hair, wearing a brown wool coat. She stopped at the newsstand, picked up a magazine, and stood next to the man. Neither spoke. Neither made obvious eye contact, but after about 30 seconds, they both left the stand simultaneously and walked in opposite directions. Agent Brennan, monitoring via radio from a vehicle parked on N Street, confirmed the observation. Pattern confirmed. Initiating surveillance on target. One agent followed the man on foot. A second team followed the woman. The man walked 3 blocks east, entered an office building on M Street, and went up to the 3rd floor. Subsequent surveillance confirmed that the building housed commercial offices, including a consulting firm called Global Analytics Partners, that employed several individuals with ties to Eastern European countries. The woman walked north, took a taxi on Wisconsin Avenue, and was taken to a residential address in Cleveland Park. Over the next 5 days, surveillance was maintained. Mikhail appeared at Starbucks again on Tuesday, November 24th. Same pattern. Name in Cyrillic. Newsstand. Brief meeting with another person. Robertov appeared on Friday, November 27th. Large latte. David wrote Robertov. Same behavior. Newsstand. Brief contact. On November 30th, Agent Brennan met with David again, this time at the FBI field office. She explained that the investigation had confirmed her suspicions. The individuals David had identified were behaving in a manner consistent with foreign intelligence operations. The writing on the cups seemed to serve as visual confirmation that it was safe to proceed to the next stage of contact at the newsstand. The FBI was now expanding the investigation to identify all individuals involved, determine what kind of information was being exchanged, and potentially disrupt the network. David would be essential to the operation, but he needed to continue acting exactly as before. Any change in his behavior could alert the network that they had been detected. "Are you okay with that?" Brennan asked. David nodded, though he felt the weight of the situation for the first time. He was no longer just observing. He was now part of an active counterintelligence operation. On December 2, 1987, a counterintelligence task force was officially established to investigate what was internally referred to as Operation Hot Cup. Agent Brennan led the team, assisted by Agent Hayes and 4 additional specialists in Soviet surveillance and intelligence analysis. The first priority was to identify each individual involved in the network and determine their roles. Surveillance was expanded to include not only Starbucks and the newsstand, but also the workplaces, residences, and movements of all identified targets. Over the next 3 weeks, the picture began to take shape. Mikhail was identified as Viktor Leonidovich Sokolov, 46, employed at the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C. as a cultural attaché. He had diplomatic immunity and had been stationed in the U.S. since 1985. Background checks indicated that he was strongly suspected of being a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover. Robertov was identified as Daniel Marcus Levinson, 39, a defense analyst working for a think tank called the Institute for Strategic Studies, which conducted research on military policy and U.S.-Soviet relations. Levinson had secret-level security clearance and regular access to classified briefings on nuclear strategy and arms control. Surveillance analysis revealed something critical. Levinson wasn't just receiving signals at Starbucks, he was passing information. On December 8th, agents observed Levinson entering Starbucks, ordering his latte, receiving the cup with Robertov written on it, and then, instead of immediately leaving, sitting at a table near the window for approximately 5 minutes. He placed the cup on the table, took documents out of his briefcase, pretended to review something, and then left the documents on the table when he got up to add sugar to his coffee at the condiment bar. When he returned, the documents were still there. He put them back in his briefcase, finished his coffee, and left. But high-resolution video surveillance installed by FBI agents showed that when Levinson got up, a second person, a man sitting 2 tables behind him, also got up, walked over to Levinson's table, pretended to look for something he had dropped, and used that moment to quickly photograph the documents with a miniature camera hidden in his hand. The entire exchange took less than 15 seconds. The second man was identified as Alexei Vasilyev, 33, second secretary at the Soviet embassy, another KGB officer under diplomatic cover. The system was now clear to investigators. Levinson would arrive at Starbucks and order a drink using his first name, David. Following his established pattern, would write the name in Russified form. This served as confirmation to Levinson that it was safe to proceed. Levinson would sit down and leave documents exposed briefly. Vasilyev would photograph the documents. Both would leave and, if necessary, briefly meet Sokolov at the newsstand to confirm the transfer. The name on the cup was the key that activated the entire sequence. During the first week of January 1988, the FBI obtained court orders to install listening devices in Levinson and Sokolov's apartments. Vasilyev had diplomatic immunity, and his apartment could not be legally entered. The microphones in Levinson's apartment picked up revealing conversations. On January 9th, he was recorded talking on the phone with someone who was not identified, discussing upcoming meetings, and using coded phrases such as, "The coffee was good this morning," and "The barista got my name right." On January 14th, a court-authorized trash search of Levinson's apartment revealed discarded documents that matched classified materials related to START, strategic arms reduction talks, negotiations between the US and the Soviet Union. The evidence was mounting. Levinson was actively spying for the KGB, using Starbucks as a transfer point, and relying on the Russified names written by David as confirmation signals. But there was one critical problem. Two of the three key players, Sokolov and Vasilyev, had diplomatic immunity. They could not be arrested without creating an international diplomatic incident. The only person vulnerable to criminal charges was Levinson. On January 22nd, Agent Brennan made the decision to move for arrest before the network could detect the surveillance and shut down operations, or before Levinson could pass on additional information that would compromise national security. On the morning of Friday, January 29, 1988, 10 FBI agents gathered in a temporary office 2 blocks from Starbucks for the final briefing on the operation. The plan was to arrest Daniel Levinson immediately after he left Starbucks, but before he could reach the newsstand or make any contact with Sokolov or Vasilyev. The timing had to be perfect. Premature arrest could alert the other members of the network. Arrest too late could allow Levinson to dispose of evidence. At 7 a.m., agents were in position, 3 inside Starbucks disguised as morning customers, 4 in unmarked vehicles around Wisconsin Avenue, 3 on foot nearby. David Chen opened the store at 5:30 a.m. as usual, aware that today was the day, but forcing himself to maintain his routine exactly as he had for months. At 7:31 a.m., Daniel Levinson entered the Starbucks. He wore a gray suit, carried his usual leather briefcase, and appeared completely calm. He placed his order at the register where David was working. "Large latte, please." "Name?" "Robert." David wrote Robertov in Cyrillic, as usual. Levinson waited while David prepared the latte. When his name was called, he took the cup, looked at the name written on it, and nodded slightly, as he always did. Then he walked to a table near the window and sat down. Agent Brennan, monitoring via radio, gave the command, "Target seated, waiting for second subject." 2 minutes later, Alexei Vasilyev entered. He ordered a black coffee, paid, and sat down 2 tables behind Levinson. Levinson opened his briefcase, took out a manila envelope containing what appeared to be printed documents, and placed them on the table in front of him, pretending to review something. He got up, walked to the condiment bar with his latte, and turned his back to the table. Vasilyev immediately got up, walked over to Levinson's table, pretended to look for something on the floor, and took a miniature camera out of his coat pocket. Agent Brennan gave the command, "Execute now! Execute now!" 3 agents inside the Starbucks moved simultaneously. 2 surrounded Vasilyev, identified themselves as FBI agents, and detained him without formally arresting him due to his diplomatic immunity. The 3rd agent quickly walked over to Levinson's table and confiscated the documents before Levinson could return. Outside, as Levinson exited the Starbucks, apparently confused about the commotion but still trying to maintain his composure, 4 agents converged. "Daniel Levinson, FBI, you are under arrest for espionage. Put your hands on your head." Levinson froze for a split second, then complied. He was handcuffed, searched, and placed in an FBI vehicle while Starbucks customers watched through the windows, shocked and confused. Simultaneously, a second FBI team executed a search warrant at Levinson's apartment in DuPont Circle. Agents found a Minox camera, the type used for photographing documents in espionage, 7 rolls of undeveloped film, $22,000 in cash hidden inside a ceiling fan, a notebook containing coded names and dates that corresponded to the days he had visited Starbucks, handwritten instructions in Russian on how to operate the miniature camera. Viktor Sokolov, the third identified member of the network, was not at Starbucks that morning, but he was spotted leaving the Soviet embassy at 9:15 a.m. and approached by FBI agents. Due to his diplomatic immunity, he was not arrested, but he was informed that he was persona non grata and had 48 hours to leave the United States. Alexei Vasilyev received the same notification. Both Soviet diplomats were escorted to Dulles International Airport on January 31st and put on flights back to Moscow. David Chen watched it all unfold that morning, still working behind the counter, making coffee for customers who had no idea they had just witnessed the disruption of an active KGB espionage operation. Daniel Marcus Levinson was formally charged with multiple counts of espionage under the Espionage Act of 1917. The charges included theft of national defense information, unauthorized communication of defense secrets to foreign agents, and conspiracy to commit espionage. During his initial interrogation, Levinson invoked his right to remain silent, but after 72 hours, after consulting with a criminal defense attorney and being presented with the volume of evidence against him, including audio recordings, documents recovered from his apartment, and video surveillance footage showing the transfers at Starbucks, he began to cooperate. In his testimony to the FBI, recorded over several weeks in early 1988, Levinson admitted that he had been recruited by the KGB in 1986 during an academic conference in Vienna. A man who introduced himself as a professor of political science at Moscow University had approached him, initiated discussions about nuclear deterrence theory, and over several months cultivated what appeared to be an intellectual collaboration. Eventually, the professor revealed that he represented Soviet interests and offered Levinson significant compensation for consulting that involved sharing unclassified analyses of American defense policy. The consultancies gradually escalated. Unclassified analyses became sensitive summaries became classified documents, and the compensation grew from a few $1,000s to regular payments of $5,000 to $8,000 per transfer. The Starbucks system was implemented in September 1987, about a month before David Chen began to notice the patterns. Levinson was instructed to visit Starbucks on specific mornings, use his real name when ordering, and observe how the barista wrote the name on the cup. If the name was written in standard English, he was to abort the operation and leave. But if the name was written in Russified or Cyrillic form, it indicated that it was safe to proceed with the transfer. The system depended on David doing something he was already doing naturally, Russifying names based on perceived accents. The KGB had been observing David for weeks, noting his linguistic habit and building an operating system around him without his knowledge or consent. Levinson explained that he had never met Viktor Sokolov in person before the operation. All communication was through Vasilyev, who served as the primary handler. Sokolov functioned as a supervising officer, coordinating multiple operations and rarely making direct contact with assets. The documents Levinson had passed included classified briefings on START II negotiations, internal analyses of vulnerabilities in American missile defense systems, assessments of NATO military capabilities, budget information on nuclear weapons programs. Intelligence estimates suggested that the information Levinson provided during his 16 months of active espionage had given the Soviet Union significant insights into American negotiating positions and technical defense capabilities. Daniel Levinson went on trial in June 1988. The trial lasted 3 weeks and included classified testimony presented in sessions closed to the public. David Chen testified about the patterns he had observed, the reactions of customers, and how the signaling system worked. On July 17, 1988, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. Levinson was sentenced on August 5, 1988, to 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that Levinson had betrayed the trust placed in him, compromised national security during a critical period of Cold War tensions, and demonstrated sophistication and premeditation in his actions. Levinson served 23 years before being released on medical parole in 2011. He died in 2014. Viktor Sokolov and Alexei Vasilyev returned to the Soviet Union in January 1988. Records declassified after the collapse of the USSR in 1991 suggested that Sokolov continued to serve in the KGB until 1992, when the organization was dissolved and restructured. Vasilyev left the intelligence service and became a businessman in Moscow. Neither faced criminal charges in Russia. The Starbucks in Georgetown continued to operate until 2019, when it closed during a corporate restructuring. The building now houses a boutique clothing store. David Chen completed his PhD in linguistics in 1991 and became a professor at American University, where he teaches Slavic languages and forensic language analysis. He occasionally consults for federal agencies on linguistic analysis in counterintelligence cases. In a 2017 interview, 30 years after the events, David reflected on the case. "I was just a graduate student working in a coffee shop to pay the rent. I played around with the spelling of names because I thought it was funny, because it reminded me of my linguistic research. I never imagined that someone would build an espionage system around my silly habit of writing names in Russian, but that's how it works, I suppose. Espionage isn't always about sophisticated technology. Sometimes it's about observing human behavior and exploiting it." The story of Daniel Levinson and the Starbucks signaling system illustrates how intelligence operations during the Cold War often relied not on advanced technology or dramatic infiltrations, but on exploiting common human behaviors in common places. A barista playing with names, a subtle reaction, a cup of coffee, and for 18 months it worked perfectly, until someone with linguistic training noticed that the reactions weren't what they should be. If you found this story fascinating, you need to hear about how a pizza delivery route revealed a secret KGB hideout, where a delivery man noticed that certain customers never ate the pizza they ordered, never invited him in, and always paid with new bills, and how a forgotten receipt led to the biggest Soviet espionage bust of the 1980s,